right, good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to be here with you today. My name is Amber Hewett. I'm the Senior Director for Offshore Wind Energy with the National Wildlife Federation. I am joining you from Massachusetts, so it's about after hours for me, so anything could happen up here. We'll see, it could get wild. I'm going to have this esteemed set of panelists introduce themselves in a moment, but we'll be talking to you today about coexistence. And as you may have seen from the description or just gathered from who is on this panel, we're going to be able to cover a pretty wide breadth of aspects of coexistence, who and what offshore wind is coexisting with. So I will turn it over to them to introduce themselves so you can kind of see what kind of perspective we have here on the stage with us today. I'm going to start at the end with Matt, and then we can work this way.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Dumlao. I'm the Executive Officer for State Lands Commission. First, just wanted to thank all the organizers and everyone for inviting me today. It's been a really productive conference so far. And just a little bit about State Lands Commission. We manage about 4 million acres of land from the mean high tide out to 3 miles, as well as on rivers and lake bottoms. So we are essentially the landowner for the subsurface land upon which all the cables and other infrastructure for offshore wind will be placed. And so we have a pretty big role in leasing, issuing leases for projects that utilize state lands. And we are also the CEQA lead for offshore wind projects. And then we also work very closely with ports. And so we've been very involved with the port development plans and the AB 525 port chapters. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Isabel Irad. I am a sustainability specialist at Blue Lake Rancheria. Blue Lake Rancheria is a federally recognized tribe located in Humboldt County whose ancestral territory spans Wiggy, which is the name for Humboldt Bay, and Salatluk, which is the Wiyot people's language. And as a sovereign tribal nation, Blue Lake Rancheria has inherent rights and responsibilities to protect and steward its lands, waters, airshed, and its people, as well as recognizing the importance of addressing climate change through resiliency efforts, tribal energy sovereignty, restoration, reducing its emissions. And I wanted to mention too that we also have the solar microgrid, which is internationally recognized for its resiliency efforts, partnership with the Schatz Energy Research Center and other important partners. And I started as a fellow working at Blue Lake Rancheria, tracking offshore wind engagement at the state, federal, local level. And I did a research project with my colleague on zero emission infrastructure and green port strategies relevant to Humboldt. And so the perspective I bring to this panel is just listening and learning, and you being here today is you making an effort to listen and learn. And I really thank you all for being here.
That was great. My name is Dr. Sarah Hinkle. I'm an associate professor at Oregon State University. I'm one of the associate directors for the Pacific Marine Energy Center, which is a consortium of OSU, University of Washington, and University of Alaska Fairbanks focused on marine hydrokinetics. And I'm also on the leadership team of the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, which is Oregon State University, Humboldt State, or Cal Poly Humboldt now, and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And by trade, I'm a benthic ecologist, so mostly focused on interactions with habitats and species, and I've been working in this space since 2009.
Hi, I'm Kate Huckelbridge. I'm the Executive Director of the California Coastal Commission, and I've been in this role several years now, but before that I was a scientist in our Energy, Ocean Resources, and Federal Consistency Unit, so I was the lead for offshore wind essentially since its inception in California. So I have long relationships with many of the folks in this room and have been in the space for quite a long time. The California Coastal Commission is a planning and regulatory agency. We regulate all development on California's coast. We also implement the Coastal Zone Management Act, which is a federal law that basically forms a partnership between the state and federal government to manage coastal resources, and which gives us a regulatory and review role on all projects in federal waters that could have an impact on state coastal resources. So I guess I'll end there and turn it back to you, Amber.
Perfect. All right, thanks everyone. So as you just shared, this group is gathered here because all of you, in part of your role is to consider how offshore wind can or will interact with people, communities, wildlife, fisheries, and given where California is, where the West Coast is really in their offshore wind journey, you have the ability, the opportunity to take this on with ambition and aspiration in a really forward-looking way. And with this, what the past year and a half have delivered on the federal level, with an unfortunate gift of time that we have to take this on, it was always going to be a long road, but it's perhaps a bit of a longer journey ahead of us. I'd love to use most of our time on this stage to just talk about how to use that time well. All of these different elements of coexistence take a long time to get right, and so this is an opportunity, perhaps, whether we wanted it or not, to really be able to move through this process in a thoughtful way. But before we get to the sort of forward-looking, I do want to just take a few minutes here to set the stage with where we are and to catalog some recent progress, perhaps since the last Pacific Summit. I'm going to start with you, Kate. And I'm sure that many in this room are familiar with the statewide strategy for the coexistence of California fishing communities and offshore wind energy. It actually has gotten a few shout outs on earlier panels already today. And it's just getting a ton of accolades out in the offshore wind world. So congratulations on that work. For those who are not familiar, can you just share a bit about what the strategy entails, how it came together, and how it's being used today, and sort of your vision for it into the future?
I would be happy to. I'm incredibly proud of this work. I definitely appreciate the shout outs from the earlier panels. So essentially what the statewide strategy is it's a framework, an analytical framework essentially for assessing impacts to fisheries, whether they're commercial, tribal, recreational fisheries, describes how to avoid and minimize those impacts, and then sets up a framework for mitigation if those impacts cannot be avoided. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. It also includes communication protocols. It includes a methodology for socioeconomic analysis of impacts to the fishing industry, and then some best practices and protocols for data collection and offshore surveys. So, I mean, that's a very high level what the strategy entails, but essentially how it came to be was when the Coastal Commission was reviewing the consistency determinations for the two different lease areas that we have in California, Humboldt and Central Coast. As part of that work in reviewing and trying to get our hands wrapped around what the impacts might look like, what should we be concerned about, we obviously did our homework and reached out to our friends on the East Coast to understand what projects had been moving forward on the East Coast and what was working and what was not working, and just to try to understand how they were thinking about, in this case specifically, impacts to fisheries. And what occurred to us is that each project was sort of developing mitigation packages and frameworks project by project, and that didn't seem to work for California, as we were thinking about two different lease areas with different fishing communities, different fisheries associated with those, some the same, some different. And I think, so what we decided was we really needed some way to start planning for this ahead of time, to be thinking through ahead of time how we wanted to look and think about impacts to fisheries. And so as part of our consistency determination, which is basically the way that we reviewed the leasing with BOEM, the Federal Agency Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, as part of our CZMA review. We included a condition in that consistency determination that required basically BOEM and the state to work together to develop a framework for understanding impacts and addressing mitigation to fisheries. So that was kind of the kernel of the idea. That's where it started. And that was in 2022. And then the next year, there was a Senate bill by Senator McGuire. It was Senate Bill 286 that essentially codified that idea and that requirement and gave it a little bit more bones on what it needed to be. It also gave us a 2-year timeline to get it done. and basically created, so that legislation directed the Coastal Commission to convene a working group and develop a statewide strategy. So that's kind of how it came to be. So we spent, immediately got to work once the legislation was passed and pulled together a working group that was made up of fishermen from all up and down the state, representing different regions and different fisheries, state and federal government reps, and then we had a representative from each of the 5 lessees in California that were all working group members. And we spent a little bit of time at the beginning of that working group kind of setting rules of engagement. How do we want to work together? How, we tried, how do we want to have these difficult conversations? Because we know it was going to get hard. We had fantastic facilitation, which turns out to be one of the most important things that we did for this working group. We actually had 2 different facilitation groups, so shout out to Kearns and West and CBI for helping us manage through that. And then we spent 2 kind of hard years having difficult conversations in person when possible. We had the fishing group as a whole working through the various components of what the strategy needed to include, and then we had separate little working groups, which is where the actual work happened. And honestly, the success of the strategy, at least getting to the end, I think is in large part due to the working group members really being willing to put in the time and the effort to get to a strategy that everybody could live with. Because as no one will be surprised, not everybody got what they wanted. There was a lot of stretching that needed to happen from all parties associated with the working group, and their ability to do that and really come together and build the relationships they needed to across the different industries, I think is what mattered, and it got us to the strategy. So we had a draft strategy that was put out earlier this year. We did a public hearing on it, and then in April, the commission adopted the final strategy. And again, I'm incredibly proud of this work. I think it's a robust strategy. It is not, I think it's one way to think about it is the beginning of the work, though. There's still more to be done. When projects do eventually come to California, that is when the strategy will be used by the developers as well as the fishing communities to come together and understand impacts and then move forward from there, develop agreements and things that need to happen. So I think, looking forward, we've done a lot of good work, one, to build relationships across those 2 industries, fishing and offshore wind. I think that was incredibly successful and important and will be important moving forward. Also importantly, we learned some things about a process. When it was a difficult, contentious process, and we were able to work through it, and we learned some things about how to do that, which I think will be valuable in a lot of other different arenas that the state needs to engage in. But also the framework that we've established, I think, while incredibly, will be incredibly useful in the offshore wind space, it could potentially even be useful in other spaces. And so I think we're excited about the outcome of it and all the possibilities that it opens. So with that.
Thank you so much. Just an incredible accomplishment and just a really inspiring story there as well. So appreciate those lessons learned. I'm actually, just given the heft of this accomplishment, going to stay on the topic for a little longer and turn it over to you, Matt, to share some reflections on the importance of the strategy in this moment.
Sure. I told Kate earlier that I think my role will be to come up here and say, congratulations, Kate, that was amazing. and it truly was an incredible accomplishment. And that really needs to be highlighted, made in bold, underlined a few times, because the types of conversations that Kate was describing are incredibly challenging. And I was thinking about that when Dan earlier, when he was moderating his panel, mentioned that you can only go as fast as the speed of trust. And these conversations lead to more and more trust. And it also it provides that framework to address a particularly thorny part of offshore wind, but there are many thorny parts potentially, and having that commitment from the stakeholders, from the tribal governments, from state, federal representatives, having the commitment, to sit down and have those conversations, it builds on itself. And when I just think about all the different areas that we're going to have to talk about with offshore wind as it becomes more and more of a reality in the coming years. the time that we spend on these conversations now, the time we spend developing a strategy, these documents that can evolve as conditions evolve and new perspectives are brought to the table, that will yield results down the road. So congratulations, Kate. Tremendous accomplishment, and I think it gives me a lot of hope for other areas that we have to navigate when it comes to offshore wind in the years to come.
Great, thank you. All right, we are going to move on from the strategy, but if anyone hasn't read it, I hope we've encouraged and inspired you all to do so. I'm going to go to you, Isabel, next, just to share a bit about how offshore wind coexistence intersects in your role and any accomplishment or milestone that you'd like to share from the past year.
Yeah, so Blue Lake Rancheria actually was part of the Coastal Commission Statewide Strategy for Coexistence, fishing communities and offshore wind energy. And it was, a difficult conversations over the course of 2 years, and they were very adaptable to new ideas, to new facilitation, and I really thank the Coastal Commission for their hard work in adapting. Blue Lake Rancheria, like I said, tracks a lot of federal, regional, state, local level happenings for offshore wind, and that has involved also our work in tribal clean energy, in emissions reductions, like Chairperson Ramos had mentioned, our work in regional and tribal workforce development. I work on a pre-apprenticeship for low voltage electricians to help tribal members and tribal descendants be provided access to opportunities that they otherwise would have barriers to in an early career training opportunity, and providing them those pathways to livable wage careers. That those training opportunities are very few and frequent in Northern California. And we also, as a team at Blue Lake Rancheria, we participate in the port planning, the terminal engagement, as well as community engagement with our partners, the Core Hub, the Redwood Region Climate and Community Resilience Hub, Core Hub. They're sitting at a table back there. And if you want to raise your hands, yeah, thank you so much for being partners in the work. As well as the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, POW-C. We met also yesterday with Core Hub and Long Beach residents and activists with the Impact Project and the East Yard communities. They're sitting somewhere over there. And yeah, we just do a lot of different engagement opportunities to learn and listen and be respectful of all of the different perspectives related to offshore wind. Our team also has hosted a training with the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. Some of you I met today were at the training on May 8th, and it basically described generally the history of national Indian policy and how that has impacted how we work in tribal lands today when it relates to energy in general. And so that was a really great training opportunity for anybody in the community to be participating in. Another great milestone was my role in a tribal liaison group for the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Mathematics study. I'll read it out loud. It's the impacts on shipping and commercial, tribal, and recreational fisheries from development of renewable energy on the West Coast. And it's basically an expert consensus study that was requested by Congress, sponsored by several federal agencies to talk about potential impacts to fisheries. And what it boils down to is what everybody kind of already knows in this room probably, is that community engagement is so important. And to do that, you need to have meaningful conversation. You need to reduce the undue burden on communities when it comes to community engagement, be respectful of their time, be respectful of tribal governments, as well as being able to address community needs in a meaningful way, not just telling them what they need, but actually hearing and listening to the community. And the last thing was a recommendation for showing up and building relationship based on mutual understanding. And I'll give an example, but I think Director Kate, you touched on this, like having difficult conversations is actually really important because it allows us to share what our limitations are as well as our interests. And that ultimately leads to innovation. It leads to creative problem solving. And we're able to actually, bring us to a truly just transition for our energy infrastructure. And then I also want to shout out another project that the Blue Grand Trio tribe was a partner with. If you all search on your phones now or later, the Tribal Fisheries Resilience Project with Cal Poly Humboldt. That was a great partnership with other tribal nations, with the state and federal partners, and that basically provided baseline data on culturally important fish species that we otherwise wouldn't know too much about, including green sturgeon in Wiggy, Humboldt Bay, salmon species on the Botawat or Mad River, and other culturally important species to other tribal nations up and down the North Coast. So it's a really fascinating project. We had grad students at Cal Poly Humboldt do this project, and you can see their data online at the Cal Poly Humboldt website. And yeah, from that experience, learning from those grad students, learning from folks in Rhode Island. I was part of a delegation that went to Rhode Island and learned about shellfish growers and fisheries, coexistence out there. Just learning that we actually have such a unique and diverse and just a beautiful ecosystem up in Wiggy in Humboldt Bay. And we need to have those difficult conversations because there are coexistence of other users in the bay, including the non-human relatives, the non-human communities that are so essential to our way of life up there. And it's important to also include Indigenous voices in that because they're able to speak on behalf of some of those communities.
Fantastic. Thanks, Isabel. Sarah, can you just kind of wrap up this stage setting segment with any sort of accomplishment or milestone that you'd like to celebrate from your aspect of this work?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep it brief so we can get to the second question you have for us all. We at Oregon State University, from the human community's perspective, we're wrapping up our survey on community perceptions of offshore wind and wave on the West Coast. So some questions similar to what you heard over the luncheon and some other additional ones. And so the report from that project will be forthcoming pretty soon. We also did recently complete a study along with our partners at Humboldt via the POWSI and some other partners, a study on community benefits and concerns of offshore wind development. I think I have the title of that right. Where we were asking specifically potentially affected communities on the West Coast where projects are proposed, what do they see as the benefits and the risks of like capital CBA community benefit plans? What would be their preferences for them? And then also asking the developers for their perspectives about community benefit agreements. And so that work was done by PhD student Tawfiq Hussain. And postdoc Julia Bingham has been kind of running the seminar circuit on that. So you can search for their names if you want information about that project. But I think that's going to be really informative to the process, getting those perspectives on CBAs. In terms of the marine community organisms, a really big milestone is that the PacWave project that Sharon Kramer mentioned in the last panel, which we did have a collaborative working group, probably named the same because Kearns and West did facilitate it. The PacWave project is a wave energy test site that's run and operated by Oregon State University. And in fall 2024, we laid our 4 high voltage subsea cables. So we have existing offshore renewable energy cables laid off the coast of Oregon. And before, during, and after cabling, we were doing acoustic monitoring. I've been doing benthic monitoring at the site for the last 14 years, so we have an incredible time series. And the RFP is on the street right now for an ROV contractor to conduct ROV surveys to check what state the cable is in now after a year and a half after installation. So that is a huge milestone that we laid 50 miles of cable. And we're 2 years into the post-installation monitoring for that.
Well, thank you all for such a rich set of examples. I think you very likely kind of boosted the spirits of folks in the room after what feels like largely a tough year, so thank you for that. You've shared a bit of a window into this, but I want to spend the next few minutes talking about kind of your approach to this work, how you think about decision making and your engagement with decision making if you're not in a decision making role, but yeah, just how you kind of come to this work. I'm going to start with you, Matt. Can you share a bit about what the public trust doctrine, what role it plays in the current State Lands Commission decisions, and how you anticipate the doctrine or other policies being applied to offshore wind projects going forward?
Yes, absolutely. So the public trust doctrine is our guiding principle. It's our foundation. It's the concept that we are that we enforce and we carry out for all of what we call sovereign lands or lands that are owned by the state. So I'll take you back to 1850 when the state became a state, and we were entrusted with these lands for the benefit of all Californians. And we had to manage them, and we have to manage them consistent with the public trust doctrine. And it's really an intergenerational commitment, I would say. It's the public trust doctrine. We have to manage these lands for the benefit of the people. And historically, the primary principles were for the furtherance of commerce, navigation, and fisheries. And over time, that's expanded to natural resource protection, public access, and things like that. And so when we look at offshore wind projects, you know, whether it's a cable on the seafloor or some other component, or the wind turbine itself, we have to look at it through that prism of the public trust doctrine, and is it consistent? So that's what we're going to be basing our analysis on. Like I mentioned, also we're the CEQA lead, so there's a whole framework of CEQA that we will be using to analyze projects when they come forward. But that public trust doctrine is really our guiding principle, and I encourage anyone who is thinking about building out in state waters to come talk to us beforehand. We can often help you figure out what is consistent, what isn't consistent. That way you don't spend years and years going down the wrong path. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Isabel, I'm going to sort of flip the question a bit for you. And in your work with Blue Lake Rancheria, is coexistence even the right framing for this conversation? How do you think about offshore wind development, and how do you aim to engage with and influence its trajectory, if you'd like to go outside of the label of coexistence?
Thank you. Yeah, sure. I'm getting to really understand what meaningful dialogue in this space looks like. And we all kind of share a sense of responsibility. But to whom and to what? And I, as a tribal staff person, might speak to person X over here about offshore wind. We're talking about offshore wind, and we're actually talking about our interest and care for the ocean. We're talking about our shared interest and concern for air quality. We're talking about our shared interest on addressing climate change. And it could be, a number of different things, but we are sharing perspective and mutual understanding of a priority rather than having a set goal in mind, right? We're starting from a place of mutual understanding. And so that's some of the things that I think about when I think of the word coexistence in this space, that we're coming together with a mutual understanding, a mutual priority that's so simple, such as care for wildlife. One other thing is that we all know to do no harm to each other, to the environment, but for many people, including myself, I didn't learn about the recent harms done to indigenous people, especially in Northern California, until I started working in Northern Michigan with indigenous rights and sustainability there during grad school. And that's not something that I was taught in grade school, right? And so when we're talking to, each other, we're talking about doing no harm. Thank you, Lonix, over there from Core Hub yesterday. That also means learning about what harms were done to Indigenous people in the very recent past, including forced relocation, massacres, assimilation in boarding schools, and for Northern California, the still persistent harm today for disproportional rates of violent crime and missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. And so when we're coming into these spaces, we need to talk about those harms, unfortunate harms, including the environmental harms, the boom and bust cycles that Chris Mickelson also mentioned earlier today, that we're still repairing and we're still cleaning up those legacy harms. And then I also want to mention what guides my work is, of course, tribal leadership and tribal council. And one of the projects that I worked on this past 2 years actually was a tribal cultural landscape assessment. And it's basically an approach to learning about what's important to the tribe and its members by acknowledging the fact that only Indigenous people who have relations to the land and waters can inform and formulate what traditional knowledge is, what Indigenous knowledge is. And that is like a term that is being thrown out a lot recently, traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge. How do we integrate those things in science? And I myself am not a Native person, and so I can't be the one to say what the impacts are to offshore wind. It's the Indigenous people that have relations to those lands, to those waters, and so we need to have those people in the decision-making table. They need to be part of the co-production of knowledge. They need to be part of that shared understanding with conversations with industry, so that we can uplift traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge in a respectful way. And the tribal cultural landscape assessment is in its final publication phases. We're going to be releasing that sometime this year with other West Coast tribal cultural landscapes. So other tribal nations are part of that report. And yeah, just being able to speak, what benefits the tribe's own cultural and environmental programming can gain from that assessment. It's talking about language, it's talking about science, we're talking about intergenerational knowledge, and it's not just siloing Western science by itself, but braiding it together with language, with cultural science. And so those are the things I think about with the coexistence term, being able to braid those knowledge systems together.
Thanks, Isabel. Sarah, my next question is for you. Can you talk a bit about how you consider monitoring and mitigation to be important aspects toward achieving coexistence?
Yeah, that was most of the conversations in our 6 years of pursuing a FERC license for the PacWave project with the collaborative work group. And so, the first step is a really robust mitigation plan, which is, of course, first avoid, then minimize, then mitigate in a hierarchy or a web or a framework. And taking the knowledge of all the potential coexisting users to develop those avoidance, minimization, and mitigation strategies. You can really make a lot of progress there because there is a lot of knowledge from many different users that can help us take those measures. And then having really strategic monitoring. The last panel did a really great job talking about some limitations in terms of energy, time, money. And so having your monitoring be strategic, the questions being co-developed. And so we had our collaborative work group to help us develop our monitoring plans, and then also looking forward, having it be really participatory. And so now that we have our license and our project for PacWave, we now have, instead of our CWG, we have our CAB, our Community Advisory Board of experts. We have our adaptive monitoring group who's going to consider potential changes to our monitoring plan. But personally, one of the things that I am so excited about is for the benthic monitoring that I've been doing at the site. We have Oregon State University has a STEM at Sea program, and this is a program that is funded from the state of Oregon general funds. California, take note, that the state funds 20 days at sea, and each of those days we take out a high school or community college class of 10 students. And since 2018, 33 of those days have taken students to actually participate in the sampling at the PackWave site. So over 300 students have been out there with me, hearing the story of PackWave, what it is, from me and not TV or social media, and having them participate in the sampling and actually see someone is doing the work that we said we would do. And I think that's just such an incredible program, and I'm really proud of all the youth that we've reached, and I really, really hope they go home and tell their parents about it. I haven't tested that yet. If we have time at the end, I'll talk about another participatory monitoring project initiative that we're kicking off.
Great, thank you. A question for you, Kate. I think we've established a shared sentiment that working with and incorporating the input of stakeholders is such an important part of this process. I'd love to hear from you a bit on how stakeholders can be best represented in achieving coexistence, and if you have any sort of success stories or mechanisms you'd like to share as lessons, that would be wonderful.
Well, I think I would start by just agreeing stakeholder engagement is obviously critical, and it can make or break a project, and we see that at the Coastal Commission all the time. I mean, I think I kind of just want to acknowledge and build on my my co-panelists' comments here, and that, I think at the Coastal Commission, we're regulatory, we come kind of at the end, and it's my commission's job to take in all that information and understand, are we protecting the resources it's required by the Coastal Act? Are we protecting the communities? Are we doing the right thing for the state of California? And they look at all of the things that were just discussed. And so I just want to emphasize how important it is that we really do that meaningful work, whether it's with stakeholders, whether it's meaningful engagement with tribal governments, and whether it's working like we did with the fishing community on strategies. There's a whole set of things that will need to happen. And I have appreciated this community's interest and engagement in doing that. It has not been the history of California, or frankly anywhere. To really dig into that, I think it's a newer thing, and I think it matters. I think it makes the decision making better, that the whole idea of participatory decision making, and the communities feel like they have an investment in whatever, in this case offshore wind, but it could be any other new industry or project or infrastructure, whatever it may be. But again, it's this idea that we really are sharing the both the benefits and the burdens of any new infrastructure, energy, whatever project, I think is key. And doing all this engagement ahead of time is critical. And so to your point earlier, Amber, that we have a moment here that maybe we didn't expect, but it's important to take advantage of it, to build that engagement, to really dive in and invest in those relationships, because it will matter when it eventually shows up in the regulatory space, to have a sense that was meaningful, and that you bring communities along. That's just critically important. So just want to thank, again, the community here for being really invested in that process, because again, I think it's going to make the state efforts stronger in the long term.
Thank you. No matter how many times I moderate a panel, I plan at least 10 backup questions, because my biggest fear is not filling the time, and I don't think I've ever gotten to ask one of my backup questions. We have 1 minute left, so I'm just going to wrap us up with a lightning round. I'm going to start again with you, Kate, as a heads up. Just to share, you can kind of take this in a couple of ways if you'd like, but just a few sentences on something that you're looking forward to working on in the year ahead, whether that's something you want the audience to know about in case it could welcome their engagement, or just something you might be looking forward to sharing at the next Pacific Summit and you want to give a little teaser today. I'll start with you.
Sure. Really briefly, I think what I'm really looking forward to this year is digging in on the West Coast Science Collaborative. You've all heard much about it. The last panel discussed it, something that we, the Commission, have been engaged in since the beginning, and I just can't emphasize how important that entity will be in ensuring, independent and solid science to back up our regulatory decision making and to understand how to adapt projects as we move forward, essentially. So I am excited to dig into that. Now that the strategy, we have a little bit of time to focus on something different, so we will be digging in there.
Perfect. Sarah.
All right, I do get to tell you about the Learning by Listening collaborative opportunity for tribal communities. So a new program is being launched. Oregon State University, San Francisco State, and NOAA National Marine Sanctuaries have deployed a hydrophone in the Humboldt wind energy area, and last month invited tribal members to go out on the boat and learn how to retrieve the hydrophone and turn it around and redeploy it. And then next month, we'll be holding a workshop to train interested tribal members to access and analyze those hydrophone data. And the last panel talked about how there's so much data, and we can't ask all the questions as scientists that we want to. And so training community members to be able to conduct their own investigations. And so I hope next year I can tell you that effort was a success and that we have a blueprint for recreating that in Southern California. We're doing it in the Humboldt region now, and then hopefully in Oregon in the future.
Mine was Sarah's, so I'll bide my time. And I think you heard from Chair Ramos that Lake Rancheria is very, very deeply ingrained in the community at the local level, but also the regional level. And we're thinking of multiple things: workforce development, science, braiding together with the co-production of science and traditional knowledge, as well as other coastal work that we're doing for restoration around Wiggy, around Humboldt Bay. So I'm looking forward to sharing more about what we're doing in braiding Western science with traditional knowledge.
Really quickly, State Lands Commission is going through a update to its strategic plan. So we need you. We need your thoughts and your input. We will be doing listening sessions in the coming months, and we'll really welcome the input. We do have our current strategic plan, which you can take a look at on our website, and we are excited to update it. And yeah, we're looking for your input. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. And please join me in a round of applause for our panel.